Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Danny Russel, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, joining you from New York City, along with my fellow Vice President, Wendy Cutler, who is in Washington, D.C., and the Honorable Kevin Rudd, President of both Asia Society and of ASPI, the Policy Institute, in Brisbane, Australia. But, of course, our star attraction today is the White House coordinator for the Indo-Pacific and Deputy Assistant to the President, Dr. Kurt Campbell. Welcome to Kurt, and many thanks to him for joining us today. So we've got 1 hour with Kurt, and in a moment, I'm going to ask him to walk us through the administration's overall Indo-Pacific strategy. Then I'll turn the proceedings over to Kevin so that he and Wendy and I can follow up a bit, and we'll draw from the questions that you, the listeners, provide to us. So for all the viewers, please use the Q&A function on YouTube or Facebook to put your questions forward. But first, so moderators always say that their speaker needs no introduction, and then go on to recite the speaker's bio in detail. So I'm not going to commit that particular offense, but what I will say is that Kurt Campbell and I became close partners and friends over the course of Obama's first term, when Kurt was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, and I was a director and then senior director for Asia at the NSC. And as Obama's first term ended and Kurt decided to make his exit, he talked me into leaving the White House and taking over from him as Assistant Secretary. And I mention this because it's really hard to convey just how intensely we collaborated on what was, depending on who you are, either a pivot or a rebalance. Still haven't resolved that question. How many meetings, how many trips, how many summits, how many arguments, how many brainstorming sessions, how many adventures did we have? And they were adventures: Chung Guanzhong, the Barefoot Lawyer, Scarborough Shoal. Somebody should ask Kurt about Aung San Suu Kyi's dog, Shwedagon Pagoda. Kurt, I think there's a deal with Netflix in there somewhere for your time as Assistant Secretary, and of course the follow-on series for the Indo-Pacific coordinator. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that I've got a pretty fair idea of the challenges that Kurt is up against, as well as the formidable array of skills and talents that Kurt brings to these challenges. And I think it's also fair to say, Kurt, that you brought an outsized reputation and an impressive set of credentials and to a tremendously important and a new job coordinating U.S. policy, not just to East Asia and the Pacific, but to the broader Indo-Pacific region. And certainly in the first few months, despite the pandemic, despite the challenge of being a startup and other obstacles, you've engineered substantively and symbolically important in-person summits with the leaders of our two closest Asian allies, Japan and Korea. You've masterminded what I truly consider to be a groundbreaking and extremely substantive rebirth of the Quad through the inaugural summit and its major initiatives. You've overseen the North Korea policy review. You're overseeing the various China policy reviews. You've contributed to the interim national security strategy and the G7 infrastructure financing plan, BW3. But, Kurt, you knew there was a but coming. There's still a very long and difficult road ahead for U.S. interests, for U.S. influence, for values in the Indo-Pacific. So what I'd like to ask you to do is to focus on the game plan for moving forward. We've all lived through the last 6 months. We We know about Build Back Better. We know about Compete, Contest, Cooperate. But what we don't know is really the theory of the case for what it is that you and the Biden administration are trying to accomplish in regard to the broad Indo-Pacific, in regard to Asia, in regard to China. As we used to ask ourselves, what does success look like? And how are you going to get there? So, Kirk Campbell, over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Danny, thank you very much. A very gracious introduction from a dear friend and a person I enjoyed working with very much over many years, some of the funnest times, hardest challenges, and thank you. And I want to, before we get started, I do want to put in a plug, if I can, for the Asia Society. A lot of people don't realize that when you're in government, one of the things that you try to do, at least, is to understand what's being written, what's being analyzed on the outside, and it helps give you grist for your mill. It gives you ideas and suggestions. And I can't think of, the stuff that Kevin, Wendy, and Danny have contributed over the last year has been absolutely central to what we've tried to accomplish. The best, by far, China analyst, the person who gives us the most interesting insights about how China sees its position in the world, its challenges and opportunities ahead, by far, is Kevin Rudd. And he brings not only the skill of a diplomat, but the perspective of a prime minister. So we wait basically on every month for what Kevin issues for us to understand how China is contemplating the contemporary world. Danny's work on the Belt and Road, what its significance is, weaknesses, opportunities, challenges, has been enormous. A lot of people comment about Belt and Road, but very few have looked carefully at its successes, its challenges, its financing mechanisms, its interaction with international financial institutions. Danny's work has been sensational. And finally, I will say the person who's given me the most sustenance of late has been Wendy. Her work on the digital economy, potential agreements, arrangements with like-minded countries that might help us get over the bridge about what we will do economically in Asia has been central. And I always appreciate her encouraging, optimistic continent. So I just want to, for the listeners here, for those who are supporting the Asia Society, good on you. This is a great institution and the work has been tremendous. And so Danny's given me a charge. And much of that means not going back over well-worn and well-understood territory, but I'm just going to go over a couple of quick things. And then Danny and Kevin, I'm happy to take questions. So, when people ask, what's the most important thing that we can do in Asia or in the world? It sounds tired, but it is in fact the case to recover at home. And so one of the most important things that I think we can demonstrate over the course of the next year or two is to continue our process. First, work through full vaccination in the United States. And for those of you who are studying, we're now seeing pockets of states and communities that are resistant to vaccines, overcoming that, trying to make clear that the Delta and other variants pose a very real challenge to the recovery of the United States. I don't think we anticipated quite this much, but that's been an intense effort of late, and that will continue. Obviously, Danny cited the Build Back Better, but I will say it's the component pieces of that will be critical. I will tell you that, some people question and ask, what is President Biden really committed to? Probably more than anything else, it's bipartisanship. Now, I know, deeply skeptical and suspicious Republicans question that constantly. Is this a maneuver? But in fact, I've seen it on a daily basis. I see it with respect to my diplomacy on Capitol Hill with Republicans, talking to them about China, about the Quad, about Asia. It's one of the few areas where we really see, I think, at least a true degree of bipartisanship, Danny. And some people think of bipartisanship as starting at home and then extending abroad. I think in this next phase, it's likely to be the reverse. We will find areas of common cause in Asia, not fully, but somewhat, and then we will try to build on that as we go forward. But I think the hope will be that the foundational infrastructure effort is a bipartisan effort. It's too early to tell, but there is a tremendous sense that such such an achievement will send not only a message about what's possible domestically, but what's possible internationally. Number two, I do want to underscore a huge part of this new job. And when you say new job, new position in the mix of White House, it's almost always a disaster. It's very difficult. Any new position, the new bureaucratics, everything are written with it. So it's been challenging, exciting, but everything, Danny knows it well and understands what's at stake here. I think it'd be fair to say that our engagement with allies and friends has been at the top of the list. Most of those interactions have been either in Europe or in Asia. They have been intense and they've been sustained. I think if there are any surprises to date, it is how open countries have been about their aspiration, their goals, and their anxieties about Asia. So in the past, a lot of questions about if we talk about rebalance or pivot, what is it going to mean for Europe and other countries? Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, these countries are pivoting rapidly. They are tilting much more rapidly than the United States, even to Asia. There's a broad and deep recognition that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to be written in Asia. You see it in everything that we do diplomatically. I think it is also the case that everything the United States has done of purpose in the world we have done with Europe. And I think Asia and China will not be an exception. The depth and level of engagement with countries in Europe has surprised me, frankly. And the degree of common views and common purpose has also been quite a welcome surprise. And that's not just countries like Great Britain or the Baltic countries, but France and Germany as well. We can talk more about that as we go, but those discussions range not just from assessments of the more assertive Chinese diplomacy and engagement and commercial kinds of interactions, but also what kind of steps might be important, screening investments, looking at a variety of arenas of common purpose more generally. I would also say just generally in these discussions, we have found a welcome to the United States, to the Biden administration, to work more closely with them. But I will also say I can clearly sense that there is still uncertainty. Is this the United States that we have become more familiar with? Are we going to still be committed to the operating system of Asia, or is this just another transitory phase? And so one of the biggest jobs, Danny, is trying to reassure Asian friends and European colleagues and allies of the determination of the United States to remain engaged and to sustain our common efforts internationally. And part of that is not just in the bilateral context, but rejoining international institutions, not just rejoining them, but trying to play a role in making sure that key like-minded personnel staff them. That is something that Kevin has talked about extensively. And I think I must say, we've seen in a number of circumstances both China and Russia place friends, colleagues in many of these institutions in ways that distorts its original purpose and in ways that we find challenging. The United States has to step up its game in that respect. The third area, Danny, that I think you're going to see much more going forward, particularly in Asia and particularly in Southeast Asia, is vaccine diplomacy. No country, we never think about these like a football game, but it's a helpful kind of almost mnemonic tool. We had a terrible first half, and anyone who tells you that we didn't is just not paying attention. One of the worst performances of the federal government in modern history. Yes, we seeded vaccines. That's terrific. It turns out that many of the vaccines that we're working with now had initiated and engaged on their own. But yes, the vaccine programs started in advance were important. We have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, just a tragedy at every level. I think what we've seen subsequently, I think, is an improvement in the American response. I think now the next step will be how we engage in vaccine. The term vaccine diplomacy, I think, is inappropriate. I think vaccine gifting, vaccine engagement more generally, and you will see the United States much more actively involved in this second phase, this second half, both working with COVID, but also working directly with countries with who we have special important ties with. We see this a lot in Southeast Asia. I think many countries in Southeast Asia thought, well, we've taken the appropriate steps of lockdown and personal space and public personal protection. That's going to be enough. It's not enough. Countries will not be safe until they're fully vaccinated. We've taken it on board with our own vaccine programs, but also working with the Quad. We are deeply engaged to ensure that we will provide vaccines in 2022 to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. We think this is the most important contribution that we can make in the next little while. And I think it's clear that other countries' vaccines they're important, but they are not as sustaining, we believe, as some of the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines in the United States. Fourth, in terms of what we will see going forward, finally now there's a degree of opening up. I think you're going to see some very high-level diplomacy over the course of the next 6 months. I can't go into specifics about that, but you can imagine that there is a deep recognition of the importance of Asia writ large, and you will see that from the president on down. I do want to acknowledge, I appreciate Danny's good words about engagements in Northeast Asia. But I think we recognize fully that really for an effective Asia strategy, for an effective Indo-Pacific approach, you must do more in Southeast Asia. Things have conspired, both cancellations of Shangri-La, some of the summits later this fall are going to be virtual. The spreading of the Delta virus more generally across Southeast Asia, technical difficulties, the tragedy of Burma, all these things have made it difficult, I think, for the United States to engage in a sustained way, the way we want in Southeast Asia. We are fully aware of this set of limitations and some of these concerns. And I think we want very much, Danny, in the next little while to step up our game substantially. And we recognize fully that to be effective in Asia, you have to be effective in Southeast Asia. I think I'll just conclude with this last point, if I can, Kevin and Danny. So there are many components to an American engagement in Asia. One is just a general recognition of what's taking place. I will tell you, I was out of government for 10 years. Coming back in, I was astonished by some of the things I read and saw and experienced and have had diplomatic engagements about. And one of them is just undeniable, a very assertive, determined China that wants to play the leading role on the global stage and has really quite unsentimental views of the United States, and really, I think, wants to reshape the operating system of Asia, this complex mix of freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes and sort of the forward deployment allied partnership with a different system, with components of the previous system, but things that will clearly favor China. I think quietly, a lot more anxiety about a very, very negative economic tools that China has used in certain countries. That has been concerning as well. But at the same time, I think as we realize that you're going to see this shift for the first time really in our history, the Indo-Pacific, Asia will be the center of our regional focus. And you'll see this movement from the Middle East. And it will be painful in all likelihood. We'll see some real challenges in places like Afghanistan, but a much greater focus on the Indo-Pacific. You can see that process underway in the Pentagon, rethinking long-range strike, rethinking how we're positioned in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of innovative skill being brought to the case. You'll also see much higher level diplomacy across the board. And again, as you indicated, Danny, rejoining organizations, participating more actively. But I still stand with a general presentation, which, for the United States to be really effective in Asia, we're going to need to make clear that we have an economic plan, a series of engagements. And you will see pieces of that over the course of the next little while. As Wendy indicated, we have begun some work on some engagements around digital issues. We're looking carefully at how we apply elements of the Build Back Better World set of commitments made in Europe last month, and that will include basically leveraging new finance arrangements at the DFC for infrastructure, particularly across Southeast Asia. We have aspirations to do much more on climate with respect to foundational initiatives. And I think you will see later this year when the president hosts the Quad leaders in Washington, that you'll see some commitments that will be, I hope, exciting, I think, decisive with respect to not only continuation of vaccine diplomacy, but infrastructure as well. So I think we understand what the nature of the tasks are, Kevin and Danny and Wendy. I think we recognize that that the United States has a lot of work to do. We have historically a strong position in Asia. That position has slipped, and we are at risk, and we need to make substantial investments across the board. And some of those investments are not just in issues associated with like military or agreements. They are personal and they are personnel. We need to ensure that we've created a cohort of people across the U.S. government and in business that have a deep understanding of Asia more generally. I've been a little bit surprised. We need to do much better there. The capacity in the U.S. government is not there yet for the challenges ahead. This is not a set of initiatives that will take a couple of years. This is a generational effort that we will need to accentuate and try to streamline and telescope shorter, not longer, because the challenges are real and they are great. I think at the core, I'll just conclude by saying, we get a chance to get a sense of what Chinese friends, how they do analysis of the United States. I think the more ideological people around President Xi do believe that the United States is in a hurtling fundamental decline. And they look at various indications of that, January 6th, issues associated with deep divisions in the United States. I think it is up to the United States more than anything else to make clear that this is a storyline that we have seen before. We've seen in Vietnam, we've seen during the economic crisis in the 90s, and again in the global economic crisis in 2008, 2009. Worries about that the United States was in a descent and would no longer be able to play its traditional role. These views have permeated Asia. We see it a lot in Southeast Asia and Singapore, in China, other countries more quietly. The most important ingredient in our effort going forward is to dispel those concerns and to make clear that the United States, that rumors of our decline are greatly exaggerated, and we have the wherewithal, the will, and the determination to continue to play a leading role in the global community, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific in the period going forward. I'll stop there. Kevin and Danny, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt, and welcome to our Global Asia Society audience. You're joined by audiences around the world, our centers in Washington and Houston, who are co-hosting this event today, San Francisco, LA, but of course also across Asia, in Tokyo and in Seoul, in Hong Kong, Manila, Sydney, Melbourne, as well as Mumbai. We hope to be soon opening in New Delhi as well. Zurich, where we also have a center perhaps later this year, also next year in Paris. So the global network of the Asia Society is deeply engaged with all the questions, Kurt, that you've just touched on. First one from me, my friend, is you've been at it now for about 6 months. Those of us who know how administrations work know that there is no rest for the wicked. Are you getting much sleep? How's the interagency process going? How's Jake holding up as National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken at state? Yeah. And in particular, where are you up to with your interagency processes on overall, shall we say, review of China's strategy? And are there timelines around that in the second half of the year?
Well, thanks, Kevin. There's a lot of questions there. I would say these jobs, the person who really prepared me the most was Danny. I'd worked for a bit in the White House many years ago, but it's, a very different beast now. It's a young men's or young person's game. I will tell you that. I think the ability to demonstrate stamina is a huge part of success in the job. When I was younger, I was always able to do that. And, it was an important ingredient in diplomacy. If you were able to say, look, I'll just stay at the table as long as it needs to be, that could help you in a long, complex diplomacy. The challenges of starting right after January 6th and the pandemic, Kevin, just can't be exaggerated. It's impossible to imagine. So you go to work, it's like, kind of a heavily armed first day of school, huge numbers of troops surrounding the White House in, lots of security, tremendous amount of anxiety that permeated for the first couple of months. But then, the protocols on the vaccine, the virus were remarkable. So, needed to wear a mask at all times, tested every single day, sometimes twice a day. It was difficult, challenging. And at the same time that you're trying to, kind of think about strategy and putting things together, I look back on those first couple of months and I found it very trying. And at the same time, you're reading about some of the things I was describing and you're thinking, God, our position has slipped, and look at the environment that we're dealing with. That's improved a lot. I feel much better overall. You get a little older, you learn how to pace yourself. As you were saying, I've been able to recruit just an unbelievable team of people. I just urge you to take a look at some of them. They're some of the best outside of government and in government. One of the young folks that works with me is a fellow that Kevin, named Rush Doshi. His new book, The Long Game, is just being published now. It's already #1 on Amazon. It hasn't been published yet, but it basically attempts to trace the Chinese thinking about its role globally and how it sees the United States more generally. So, and frankly, I learned from young people that I work with: Edgar Kagan, Laura Rosenberger, Simona Gutta, people who I've been able to just admire. And so, just the ability to kind of convene and hopefully let these people try to get out of their way and let them be effective is a huge part of what I'm trying to do more generally. I find the interagency very collegial, and it's not like my previous experiences. This is, I think, largely because the tasks are so challenging. A lot of the crap that you sometimes go through is just not there this time. There's a real sense of, look, we've got to muster together and move forward. There is a lot of discipline at the White House. Danny would recognize that. A lot of message discipline, a real sense of, beyond the team. I find the fact I know, like Danny does, and Kevin, you too, and Wendy, I know these people personally, and I've known them for 30 years. They know my strengths, they know my weaknesses. So, it gives you some ability to be able to operate. I'm not sure I would have done this job for many other people than Jake Sullivan. He's a deeply decent, extremely honorable, and also probably the smartest young person I've ever worked with. Just incredibly capable. I'll give you one quick anecdote just about this. We had done a call early on with some Pacific Island leaders or foreign ministers and the like, and I'd come into the office there in the West Wing, and I wanted to brief him for 5 or 7 minutes before he was going to take the call. But it was a busy day, Kevin, a lot of stuff going on, Afghanistan and stuff. And he just didn't really have as much time. And he seemed a little bit like, not scattered, but focused on other things. And I was a little bit frustrated. And I thought, gosh, I wonder if he can, navigate all these different things that he's going to have to deal with in the next 15 minutes. And then I didn't really have much of a chance. We had about, 30 seconds. And then the call started. And then for the next 15 minutes, the most perfect laydown imaginable that actually not only put me to shame, but I was almost humiliated that I'd spent so much time thinking about this. And then he put it together in just a couple of minutes, much better than I ever could have. So I'm frankly grateful to work with him. The president is deeply engaged, very interested in these issues. He is demanding, but demanding in the best possible way. So I've liked that part of it. And again, I will say Danny came into the office during one period that I was feeling a little bit low and kind of uncertain about stuff. And he reminded me about, like, every day when you leave, stop, take a look at the West Wing, take a look at the Washington Monument, remind yourself of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I try to remember that now and try to do that every day.
If I'm not mistaken, on the wall behind you, I think it's a portrait of Winston Churchill. I
actually put that up just to remind me every morning, never say no, never say no. I did one of the, I will say, Kevin, we've got some, we're deeply engaged in both the national strategy. We'll have an Indo-Pacific strategy. Those will be coming out, and we've also got some other work underway. Some of it will be public, some will be classified. Those will be coming out later this year. The amount of time internally spent working, also building on the excellent effort that Eli Ratner did on China. We're trying to, take all of this to heart, integrate it in a way that is purposeful and intensive as we go forward.
The reason I mentioned Churchill, and so I was just reflecting on what you had to say, is Fulton, Missouri, 75 years ago, the speech on the Iron Curtain and the Cold War. And it kind of beckoned us into a new age, as Churchill was given to do by what he said and partly by what he did. Tell me, Kurt, in your own view, do you think we can avoid a second Cold War with China? And how would we go about doing that?
Thank you, Kevin. So I don't like the framing of the Cold War very much, and I've appreciated the work that you've done on this. I'm fearful that framing obscures more than it illuminates, and I think it causes us to fall back on patterns of thinking and framing that is in no way helpful, really, fundamentally, to some of the challenges presented by China. And so for the United States, part of what we have to do is, I think the term is think differently. The two most recent experiences for us, one has been a hot war, a long 20-year unsatisfactory set of engagements across the Middle East, which focused a lot on special warfare and, small troop movement capabilities and overhead support. Before that was a 40-year campaign with a country we had very little to do with, except for nuclear tipped missiles. Not a lot of economic engagement, very little people to people engagement or societal interaction. So I'm not sure those are the best models more generally. But if you're asking a question, do I believe that the next little while, in terms of the relationship between the United States and China, will be different than this previous period that we broadly describe as engagement? I do. I believe that the defining characteristics of the period ahead will be around competition and also at the same time finding areas and arenas where the United States and China it's not necessarily cooperation, Kevin. I don't really like that narrow definition. It might be just alignment of policies, areas where we need to understand that purposeful efforts on both of our parts, like on climate change. Hopefully, we had hoped on the pandemic, that has been quite a disappointment, would be important as we go forward. But I do think that the period ahead has some similarities in terms of the early periods of our own Cold War in the United States. There was a lot of domestic unease, a lot of concerns about the definition of what it is that we were facing, a lot of exaggeration of certain kinds of challenges, a lot of underestimation of our own capabilities. I mean, you see some traditional characteristics that you see each time the United States has been challenged by a foreign country. We saw it even in elements of the period in the 1980s when we were worried about Japan, even. I will say, I think this time is going to be much more difficult. I worry sometimes that the Chinese leadership, one hopes to find ourselves in a situation that a degree of coexistence, of recognition that the Indo-Pacific and the world is big enough for two great powers. Some of what we've seen from President Xi and his colleagues suggests that China's ambitions surpass that. Those are things that, but those can't really be handled through persuasion. I think they have to be dealt with through performance. And so that's why I say the most important elements associated with our strategy, and for anyone, any American president, is to ensure that we've taken the right steps on technology, on education, on mustering an effective coalition of allies. I will say that, you know, oftentimes people will say, and I would take issue with it, like, oh, this is just a continuation of Trump policy. That's just completely incorrect. I think there are elements of the analysis that are comparable, but the way that President Trump tried to engage kind of in an erratic way only in a bilateral context between the United States and China is just incorrect. We really need to work this in a way that engages with other countries who share our interest in sustaining elements of, again, if you look at the operating system, Kevin, that we managed to create over and China participated in this as well. It led to the greatest accumulation of wealth and the lifting of people from poverty in human history. And so we should be very careful before we meddle with it too much. And so, you know, the challenge ahead will be to come up with a strategy that presents China with both opportunities, but also very clear challenges for taking steps that are antithetical to the maintenance of peace and stability. And that will be challenging. So anyone who tells you like, oh, this strategy is settled and it's certain, it's not. It will take a significant period to refine it. There will likely be periods of uncertainty, perhaps even periods of occasional, raised tensions. Do I think it's possible that the United States and China can coexist and live in peace? Yes, I do. But I do think the challenge is going to be enormously difficult for this generation and the next.
Just before I turn to Wendy Cutler for the next question, Kurt, you mentioned before the centrality of working with friends, partners, and allies. Here in Australia, where I am at the moment, you'll be more than acutely conscious of the fact that Australia's been on the rough end of the pineapple, as we would say here, in the relationship with China.
Yeah, but I just want to say, we don't say that. But go ahead.
And the bottom line is, it's been problematic. The economic frictions have been significant. Some of the exporters are hurting. In terms of your management of, let's call it, your aggregate relationship with China, and as it were, seeking, to the extent possible, to restabilize relations also between China and some of your allies. If I was asked you to bring out a crystal ball and to see how the second half of the year might go, do you see some light on the horizon for example, the China-Australia relationship?
Kevin, it's a good question. There are a lot of theories about how China conceptualizes Australia. I think from our perspective, it looks at least to some level that there is an attempt to cut Australia out of the herd and to try to see if they can affect Australia to completely change how it both sees itself and sees the world. I think the United States, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, National Security Council Sullivan, others have tried to make clear that we're not going to leave Australia on the field. And that's just not going to happen. And if anything, what we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months is a deepening, intensifying relationship between Canberra and Washington, even on issues. These are not completely like-minded governments, but I think a tremendous sense of common purpose with respect to some of the challenges that we were facing in the Indo-Pacific and the opportunities. Australia was also, Prime Minister Morrison, a leading supporter of us moving ahead with the Quad, and has encouraged us substantially to step up our game both in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. I don't know if it's for me, Kevin, to say whether I see an easing or improving in relations between Australia and China in the next little while. I do want to just say, and again, I count on you, Kevin, often to help us understand this new phase in Chinese diplomacy and engagement. I will say, having been a diplomat now in various capacities for 30 years, you became comfortable. I thought that China had a series of tells, if you will, about how it would operate internationally and how it would engage more generally. And one of them was that China would rarely try to take on, more than one big foreign policy challenges simultaneously. In the 90s, when it sought to basically create capacity for working to its east with its sea engagements, and recognizing that maritime power was going to be more important. You were the one who taught me in the 90s that look at what China had done, basically tying down all those countries that it had difficult relations with, border disputes, over a period of 1 year, basically sorting all of those out. So it was able to basically muster and focus in one area. What we've seen of late really is China taking on many countries simultaneously, much greater assertive actions across the Taiwan Strait. I think what we've seen between India and China has been transformative in terms of India's strategic thinking, greater engagements in the disputed island territories, the Senkakus. Wolf War diplomacy continues in Europe, muted but still very purposeful dialogue aimed at the United States, and then economic coercive actions against a number of states, most pointedly Australia. Now, I would have thought previously that given what we had seen and the success of President Biden's visits to Europe and a sense of other countries basically finding common cause with the United States, that China would be in the midst right now of a recalibration, a sense of pulling back, a rethinking of some of its actions, particularly against Australia, a country, frankly, that if you had asked me 10 years ago what country was most likely to start thinking about we have to have a different kind of relationship with China and maybe kind of think differently about the United States, it might have been Australia. I think that is completely gone now. And I'm not sure that they have the strategic thinking to go back to a different kind of diplomacy towards Australia right now. I see a harshness in their approach that appears unyielding. I don't want to be pessimistic for Australia. I know Australia is trying quietly and carefully, but I see little yield, and if anything, a rising sense of nationalism and a sense of aggrievement and a determination to continue to prosecute a very assertive case internationally across the board. And you saw that a little bit when President Xi, 100-year speech. So Kevin, I'd actually, I know you're supposed to hear from me. I'd love to hear from you. I would have thought that we were basically settling in for the long haul in terms of tensions between China and Australia. But is that accurate?
Well, I think they all want to hear from you, my friend, not from me. But I spoke to a Chinese forum on Saturday and simply said, I thought it was useful for both capitals, Beijing and Canberra, just to push the pause button for a few months as far as the rhetoric is concerned, and see what can be done to restabilise. Let me turn to Wendy Cutler, who's going to switch the agenda to trade. Over to you, Wendy.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and thanks so much, Kurt. We really appreciate the work you've done to date, and we're looking forward to continue working with you closely. I wanted to kind of pick up on something you said earlier about working with our friends and allies, and I think you said that you're hearing a lot from them on their aspirations and their goals and their priorities. I would assume trade comes in to that conversation. And I would be interested in what you're hearing from them, and assuming that you're hearing like a real desire from our friends and allies for engagement, on trade in the region. How is the administration moving forward, given domestic constraints? And do you think we might see a trade initiative coming forward by the administration for the region by the end of the year?
Thanks, Wendy. And again, as Kevin indicated, I really appreciated your testimony last week, your long service, the work that you did on TPP. And both Wendy and I are veterans of TPP, and we're careful about that because in some watering holes around Washington, you're not welcome. But still, I'm grateful for the time we served together more generally. I would say, Wendy, in almost every conversation, particularly with countries and individuals that you have close ties with, one of the first topics that comes up forward is, look, hey, great, you got a military engagement, but your ticket to the big game is going to be, can you muster economic engagement? And, countries are aware that we're still, one of the, key investors across the region. You could go through all the various indices of economic engagement more generally. But I think Asia wants to see more multilateral engagement. They want trade engagement, economic engagement. They want to see more infrastructure involvement. They want to see more project-related engagement. I think, as I indicated, Wendy, I think you're starting to see some of that. I think I won't go through and bore the audience about scoring, but I think we've sorted out how to make the DFC a much more purposeful tool in investments across Southeast Asia, and you're going to see more of that as we go forward. It is because of you, Wendy, frankly, and a few others that we're looking closely at what might be possible on the digital front. I think the president and others have indicated, look, this year has been about domestic recovery. It is also about vaccines. It is about engaging closely with allies. But at the same time, quietly, I think we are exploring a number of opportunities. I can't put a particular timing on it, but I do want to underscore that it is fully recognized that we cannot be successful without a positive trade agenda in the region as a whole. And that goes beyond whatever trade engagement that Ambassador Tai will undertake with China in the next little while. So I do want to underscore that finding that kind of initiative that fits the particular niche. I do just want to underscore for friends that again, I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking about Asia. One of the things that's fascinating is that in the past, it has always been Democrats that were somewhat ambivalent about trade and Republicans were gung-ho. Now, frankly, Wendy, we have some ambivalence in both parties and uncertainty. I think if there's one issue that we really don't know we're not going to know until we try with some initiative, it's going to be trade. And I would say probably starting smaller, starting something that we can clearly demonstrate affects and supports small and medium-sized firms in the United States, working people. I think those are going to be some of the areas that we're going to see going forward. But no one is under any illusion about why that's going to be important as we go forward.
Let me turn back to Danny to roll on with the conversation. Over to you, Danny Russel.
Thanks, Kevin. Hey, Kurt. I want to ask about Taiwan. I know it's a delicate topic, but as Assistant Secretary, you are the person who, more than anyone, made the effort to show respect for Taiwan, to promote Taiwan's dignity. But we're in a very different era. This is an environment of kind of zero-sum U.S.-China engagement. It feels like the growing friction with China is driving a series of incremental moves by the U.S. that is edging closer and closer to the line that separates unofficial relations with official relations, which in effect could hollow out America's one China policy. So I guess my question is, how much love is too much love for Taiwan? What's the right way? What's the wrong way for us to, manifest that respect and that support, which is not only important, but utterly consistent with both the One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act?
Look, Danny, it's a good question, and I'll be careful here. We support a strong, unofficial relationship with Taiwan. We do not support Taiwan independence. We fully recognize and understand the sensitivities involved here. We do believe that Taiwan has a right to live in peace. We want to see its international role, particularly in areas like vaccines and issues associated with the pandemic. They should have a role to play here. They should not be shunned in the international community. So I think it is a balance, but it is a balance that the United States accepts and supports. We do very much support Taiwan's dignity, its remarkable achievements as we go forward. And we've tried to send a very clear message of deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. And I must say, look, I'll try to be careful here. I know how much engagement the Asia Society has in Hong Kong. One of the reasons why the international community in the United States is so clear about our dissatisfaction by what China has undertaken in Hong Kong is a clear sense that quietly behind the scenes, Chinese interlocutors have studied and tried to make an assessment. If we can do this, what's the international response, and what does that tell us about what the response would be with respect to Taiwan? I just want to underscore that such an effort would be catastrophic. But at the same time, we need to signal when China has taken steps that are completely antithetical to international order, that the international community has to take, steps to signal that accordingly. That's important not only for Hong Kong, but it is also important for other things that China might contemplate. So, Danny, I completely agree with you. It's a very delicate, it's a dangerous balance, but it's a balance that must be maintained. And the United States has extraordinarily important interests in the maintenance of peace and stability, but other countries are coming to recognize that as well. Japan, Australia, Great Britain, other countries recognize that the maintenance of peace and stability is in the profound interests of international stability.
But you mentioned so much before the importance of Southeast Asia. And the administration is still young. You're barely 6 months in. But as Indonesia's friend and neighbour here in Australia, and given Indonesia's role in the G20, by far and above the largest country and economy in Southeast Asia, and a robust democracy, Indonesia is hurting badly with COVID-19. Do you have any particular plans to reach out and support across the board with our friends in Jakarta? Because these are tough times just to the north of us here.
So, Kevin, I very much appreciate the question. So we have seen a rapid succession of this kind of crisis. About 2 months ago, we saw it in India, need to rapidly ramp up our support, basically trying to assist with oxygen and PPE and other things, ultimately vaccines. I will say this carefully. So we are involved deeply engaged in diplomacy, private diplomacy with Indonesian friends, and it's still quite delicate. We've taken some steps to provide vaccines. There were some difficulties there in terms of trying to figure out whether Indonesian friends wanted to accept vaccines from the United States. I think it was also the case that I think the leadership was reluctant at taking international medical counsel about lockdowns, and a certain pride about how to handle this. I fully understand, Kevin, and I think we do, the need to step up. We have tried to do that. I have been on daily calls with Indonesian friends, encouraging, supporting, trying to take the right steps. I think we've made some headway. I think there's been a request that much of this to be done privately and quietly. We've tried to do that. There is some vaccine sensitivity there. I think you probably understand what I'm saying. I will just leave it at that. We very much want to demonstrate our partnership with Indonesia. You've been very delicate. We need to step up our game in Southeast Asia. I don't want to leave your listeners with any sense that that's not the case. We have some upcoming travel. I think we have some series of engagements. We understand. That's why I mentioned number on my list of 5, how important vaccine diplomacy is. We put Indonesia near the top of that list. We are engaging both through COVAX and in the bilateral context in the best ways to support them as we go forward.
Good. We've got just under 5 minutes to go, so 2 or 3 rapid fire ones to wind up with, if that's okay.
Sure.
First one is from Ambassador John Negroponte, who asks, what is China's reaction to the American military withdrawal from Afghanistan?
It's a great question. And I think, Ambassador Negroponte knows that China has really gone to school on how our military operates in the Middle East and South Asia. They've looked at our tactics and our capabilities. But this is a larger question. This is what will it mean for the American standing? What does it mean for the American role? I think what we think we see is a China that believes that there will be some opportunities to step in Afghanistan in the next little while. I think they recognize that the situation is more unstable than many had anticipated, and that it's going to leave some questions on near its borders. I think there is a debate for Ambassador Negroponte in China about why this is happening. Some believe that it might be about creating uncertainty on its borders. Some think it's about the United States just basically recognizing that 20 years is long enough. And still others believe this is about basically summoning the capacity to focus more on the Indo-Pacific more generally. But I think they're operating in a very clear-eyed strategic manner with respect to Afghanistan, and that doesn't surprise me.
As we close out, moving from Kabul to Kiribati, I know the South Pacific's near and dear to your own heart. Lots of pressures within the Pacific Island Forum at the moment, Kurt. US strategy towards the Pacific Island states. China has expanded its presence significantly. Fisheries, infrastructure, the rest. Your concluding thoughts on our small island states in the Pacific?
Thanks, Kevin. You're right. Very dear to my heart. I think we're planning some major initiatives with respect to the Pacific. We cannot engage the Pacific effectively without working closely with Australia, New Zealand, other countries that have support. I found in the past, I think, a peculiar sense, almost competition among some of the major states with respect to how to think about the Pacific. You're thinking about how to think about the Pacific, Kevin, was always correct. There's plenty of work to do, and coordination should be at the top of the mark. I think we have to also recognize other states have larger interests and have made more of a commitment. I put Australia and New Zealand at the head of the queue, but the United States can assist with convening. And I think we do believe that the mission ahead, and we have very deep moral and strategic responsibilities, and there's a lot to do. And I think we have been missing in action in many respects in the Pacific. And that means stepping up on just basically human welfare. It means doing more as much as possible on climate, on resilience, on clean energy. It's remarkable that as a region that has so much sunshine, it has a very low absorption rate of solar power. We need to do more on fishing. There's a number of initiatives on health that I think we can undertake. I think you'll see more of this. Again, we're ambitious here. We recognize the pressures that come to play, and this is just another area that we believe that Australia, New Zealand, other like-minded states can find common cause as we go forward, Kevin.
As I close out, Kurt, President Xi Jinping and President Biden, when do you think they'll get together? G20 in Italy, or any time earlier than that? Give us a scoop.
I think both leaders will assess, and my expectation will be that we'll have some sort of engagement before too long.
Kurt Campbell, thanks so much for your time with us at the Asia Society. You're a good friend of Danny's, our Vice President at the Policy Institute, good friend of Wendy's, former Deputy USTR, and a good friend of mine in multiple capacities over the year, and my drinking buddy when I was Prime Minister. So thank you so much for the time you spent with us. And we wish you all the best in navigating what is an extraordinarily complex 4 years ahead for US strategy in Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and the dilemma of the century, managing this relationship between the 2,000-pound gorillas in the Pacific living room, China and the United States. Go well, my friend.
Thank you, Kevin. Best of everyone. Thank you so much.